Perfect. Take it away, Jay.
All righties. Oh my gosh. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Jay Rosenbaum. My pronouns are they, them. And I'm coming to you today from Narm. We're under Jerry territory, and that is territory that has not been ceded. So I'm acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm speaking on today. I'm an AI artist and a lecturer in critical AI at RMIT School of Design. And I've been thinking about changing the name of my class a little bit to radical AI because the term AI artist has become a loaded one over the years. When I started with working with machine learning nearly a decade ago, as I was just talking about with Chris, I used it because it was easier to say than machine learning artist. Now, the term evokes ideas of shortcuts, creative theft, but I still use that term, AI artist, sometimes with a little bit of irony, because my practice deeply engages with AI systems, not just as tools, but as objects of critique and study. So today, I'm going to share my research. Next slide. Sorry. Thank you. So today I'm going to share my research and the art I created during my PhD, which explored AI perceptions of gender. My focus was on how AI interprets and represents gender, challenging binary frameworks that dominate machine learning and expanding them beyond biological essentialism. Gender is vast, and more importantly, it's deeply personal. It's more than just anatomy or a checkbox on a form. Through my work, I've asked questions like, why do AI systems perceive gender? And how do they qualify gender in the images they generate? If we create a biased data set and slowly debias it by introducing new data, how will the generated images be affected? Is it possible to debias data sets and debias a biased AI? And what are the implications for the visual representation present in generative images of people? So some heavy, heavy questions there to start off, but of course that's what research starts with, is questions. We always start with asking why, asking how. So I made 3 artworks through this. I trained a biased neural network with a GAN and sought to see if I could add data to it to change its biases and what it looks like if I did. I examined existing systems and looked at how they explore gender and what they see when presented with gender beyond the binary. And I explored a new way of looking at gender classification completely by assigning people a custom mixed color. My first project set in stone. Oh my gosh, I haven't been saying next slide. I'm so sorry. I think we're 2 on at this point. My first project set in stone began with exploring whether we can change biases in bias systems just by adding new data. So I worked with generative adversarial networks, which were kind of new at the time, but are of course now a bit obsolete. But generative adversarial networks are fascinating because they use 2 neural networks, a generator and a discriminator. And the generator creates images from the data based on the data set and learns as it creates. And the discriminator looks at those images created and goes, yes, that one resembles it. No, that one doesn't. And it passes or rejects images. And together they learn how to create images that more closely resemble the images in the data set. So I used these techniques with different architectures to explore using techniques like transfer learning, where I retrained an already trained model, and what I like to call disruption training, where new data is continuously added during training. So this approach allowed me to see whether a GAN could unlearn its original biases and adapt to new representations. That's the next one, please. The title comes from a metaphor I kept coming back to, the way AI systems encode biases as if carving it in stone, and the way gender is often treated as something immutable, particularly in AI systems. So I started with DC GAN and ProGAN models, which generate by learning patterns from a training set. My goal was to see if I could reshape that stone by injecting data that defied stereotypes. So I created my data set out of 3D rendered faces. I sculpted the faces and rendered them in animations to get enough images to train the data set. And I used them representing masculine, feminine, non-binary representations with classical marble aesthetics. So leaning into that set in stone metaphor, I'm very literal. So next slide, please. So for this project, I first trained a series of DC GANs, that's a deep convolutional generative adversarial network, with my data set of masculine faces. So once it was sufficiently biased, I would introduce feminine faces, and then faces representing non-binary aesthetics. So these images emphasize external markers of gender expression, like brightly colored hair and makeup. And these elements were chosen to highlight how gender minorities often communicate our identity visually. So yeah, this is a stereotype, but as the masculine and feminine data sets all had the exact same hairstyles, this was a visually significant way to show those changes in bias and the breaking free of the stone metaphor. It's a little on the nose, but sometimes, yeah, you do need to be a teeny bit literal. So what was fascinating was watching the way, as the data entered the new system, the generative outputs shifted. So initially, the GAN's outputs reflected the rigid binary ideas of gender. But as training progressed, these boundaries softened, vibrant colors emerged, and the works began expressing a more fluid and joyful take on gender. However, even as the GAN integrated the new data, I noticed a tendency for it to revert to its original masculine bias over time. Increasing the volume of non-binary and feminine coded data helped to counteract this reversion. But this model never fully forgot its initial biases. So here on the video, and it's showing that tendency to try and revert and go back again. So I attempted a new model, and on the next slide, you'll see that I switched to a ProGAN, a progressive growing GAN, which yielded smoother transitions. So the technique used to do bias was the key observation in this one, as I had to create directories filled with the same masculine data set initially. So all three directories had only the cis men data set in them. And then I would replace the data in two of the folders gradually with more diverse images. So this is a fitting metaphor about how some genders need to make room for the representation of others. By gradually replacing older data sets with newer images, I observed more seamless debiasing. The ProGAN created fewer artifacts and seemed to be better at integrating those diverse representations without defaulting to its original biases. The resulting visuals were presented as mosaics, wallpapers, looping videos, and from afar, they appeared as cohesive portraits. But up close, viewers could see the hundreds of smaller images that made up each face. These layers reflect the idea that gender is shaped by accumulated experiences and self-expression over time. Through Set in Stone, I learned that while debiasing GANs is possible, it's not always straightforward. The architecture of the neural network plays a huge role in how successfully it can adapt to the new data. So the DC GAN adapted to the new data by kind of glitching and creating some very interesting glitch images, but would revert to its original biases over time. The progressive growing GAN would take the images and relate to them a little more. It would transfer a little more smoothly. Much like people, AI systems can carry their history with them even as they evolve. The large-scale mosaics show not only the AI aesthetics and the debiasing of the neural network, but create a dialogue about how we're the sum of our experiences. So not just what you see on the surface. In the looping video, the face continually zooms into one square of many in the mosaic, which shifts and changes, developing into a new face, which is zoomed into again. Each face exists because of all the faces that surround it, helping it become. I show here not only the shift caused by debiasing in AI techniques, but also the experience of being transgender, the exploration of gender as observance, as expression, and as experience. This concept of gender as experience is one I return to in a later work, Gender Tapestry, discussing gender as a highly personal lived experience that is unique to every individual.
Hey, Jay,
Yes.
just which slide should we be on? I think we missed a video there.
Oh, oops. Okay. We should be on the zooming mosaic and just about to move to the Frankenstein's telephone one.
Oh, so we're still okay, cool.
Sorry.
That's okay, no worries.
So we're just flipping to the next work in the series, which is Frankenstein's telephone, which was an analysis of existing systems in a complex loop of AI architectures. So if you've ever played the game Telephone, you know how a message changes when it's passed along. So I wanted to see what would happen if I turned that idea into an AI experiment. What happens when different AI systems talk to each other? You know, they're not really talking, but for lack of a better word. Frankenstein's telephone explored how AI systems gender images, revealing the biases embedded in their datasets. This project works like a game of telephone using a chain or telestrations, if you've played the board game telestrations, using a chain of AI systems that pass an image along and its interpretation from one to the next. Process starts with a prompt and then ATTN-GAN, which was the very first text-to-image generator that created an image based on a user's image input prompt. Sorry, not image prompt. That image was then segmented by Deep Lab, breaking it down into labeled regions like sky, tree, and person. This segmented image was then reimagined by Spade Coco, which reconstructed it as a new image. And finally, Intertext generated a caption for the final image. So for the initial experiment, the captions were from the broadly gender diverse image library, stock photo image library, and I used the image descriptions as the initial prompt. So for this one, it's a young transgender woman is looking in the mirror, and then it's segmented into its various components, and that segmented image is filled in by the next system, Spade Coco, and then a new caption is imagined by Intertext, which is a little girl sitting on a toilet in a bathroom. So this one actually didn't end up misgendering the poor person, thankfully, and kept the bathroom concept, which you could see how these concepts have evolved quite significantly in the intervening years. So this chain highlighted how each system introduced new layers of interpretation, distortion, and bias. For example, Deep Lab segmentation labels all humans simply as person, removing gender entirely. That's the red. Red is person in Deep Lab. Yet by the final stage, gendered language reappeared in the captions. So binary words like man or woman would emerge based on contextual clues like clothing or background elements. So I traced this bias back to the human-generated captions in the training datasets. These captions frequently gendered people even when their faces weren't visible or when the person in question appeared abstracted or incomplete. This points to the assumption of the dataset's human annotators, many of whom worked under vague instructions through mass labor platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. There's little to no training in situations like these, just a short series of instructions. So it strikes me that a specialist could be hired to specify clearer instructions to avoid gendered outcomes, and especially the occasional sexist or racist outcomes I observed in the dataset. So if we look at the next slide, The original prompt was a woman with a dog on a leash. And we've got vaguely kind of, you've got to be gentle with ATG and GAN. It did not know what it was doing, but you've got a vague sort of dog-ish concept, and you've got sort of park-esque environment. You can kind of see, elements around the edges. And then Deep Lab's come in and gone, well, part of that dog's actually a person, and it's gotten a bit confused. And then we've got a mess from Spade Cocoa, for lack of a better word. But of course, it's kept the shapes because it's filling in those shapes that Deep Lab provided to it. And the final caption is a man riding a skateboard down a street. So it's taken those context clues. Now, there's a paper called Balanced Data Sets Are Not Enough, where they found that background images or the background data in an image played a role in the interpretation of a classification. So if there was an image of a person with children in the background, that was more likely to be classified, that person was more likely to be classified as woman because children appeared in the background of images with women more frequently, even in a balanced data set. That's just one example, but backgrounds like kitchens and spaces that are given these gendered connotations in data sets, even unintentionally, even when not labeled, would still result in the AI inferring that a person in a kitchen is more likely to be a woman, or a person with children in the background is more likely to be a woman. Non-binary people just didn't exist in these data sets. We're just, there's an example in the MS Cocoa data set that a lot of these draw from, of just a hand, a tiny hand, and somebody gendered the hand, or a tiny person as a silhouette and somebody gendered that person, even though it was impossible to tell. There's no reason for any of that. Further education would help subvert some of these biases. Better instructions would help subvert some of these biases. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that those visual outputs of Frankenstein's telephone were surreal and unsettling. These pale, fleshy figures with exaggerated alien features. I love things like this. This is what drew me to AI, with these alien images of people. These dreamlike blobs reflected in the dataset's lack of grounding in real human anatomy. They raise questions about how machines create images and perceive images around gender. For me, the work became a metaphor for how transgender and gender nonconforming people are often perceived, misunderstood, or distorted by societal expectations. An interactive version of this project allowed users to upload their own images to see how the AI chain reinterpreted them, which, went as well as could be expected. Many participants were surprised and sometimes disturbed by the results, particularly when the system misgendered them. This sparked conversations about how machines and people perceive identity and the harm caused by assumptions. So in these systems, a feminine face would usually be very, very smooth. Smoothness equals feminine. Ties equaled masculine. It was really interesting to see the things that, the patterns that it would feel. And so, of course, the relationship to Frankenstein is in these bizarre amalgamations of figures that are so alien, so unusual, and yet transgender people relate to the story of Frankenstein because that's about a story of becoming. It's a story of being rejected by society, and it's a story about being more than what people see on the surface. And so, of course, I went into that in great depth in my thesis, but it's fascinating to explore these constructions of humanity and compare them to Dr. Frankenstein's constructions of humanity, and then tie in those transgender relationships. So I took it a bit further, and this is An ongoing exploration at this point. But yeah, if we look at the excuse me, if we look at the next slide, unfortunately, the Frankenstein's telephone project, the interactive component is no longer online. The project is still online, but the interactive component has been taken offline because the tools are no longer being hosted nowadays, because the space for these systems is at a premium, and the training, the hosting costs, all of that costs corporations. And so a hosted system, if it's old fashioned, if it's out of date, most of the time it's not hosted online anymore. And they took Runway ML, who was hosting these, took the models down, and now I'm going to have to actually go and rehost them again. So I do intend to go back into the code, rehost the original repos, and take this work further. I'd like to, so this, it used the first text to image generators. So I'd like to redevelop it using the newer generative AI technologies to see how these systems have evolved, compare them, contrast them, and see if these observations still hold true. What does it mean moving forward? So I'd love to contrast that with the earlier versions and see what developments, if any, have been made. So ATTN, again, using the same prompt. I did this prompt. It was the middle of winter, in the middle of lockdown. So I wanted to be at the beach. So I did, I generated a picture of a man at the beach, a woman at the beach, and a non-binary person at the beach. And this is such a telling group of images. Men, men always wear ties, shirts and ties, wherever they are. Doesn't matter if they're at the beach, shirt and tie. That's man. Man equals shirt and tie. Woman equals wearing barely anything at all. Non-binary people don't exist. That's ATTN GAN. Thanks, ATTN GAN. Moving on. So the next iteration of text to image was VQ GAN. And the same prompts, man at the beach, woman at the beach. Those are kind of lovely and painterly. They're rather pretty. And a non-binary person is a horrifying flesh blob. Yeah, that it's terrifying. But okay, you know, whomst among us has not sometimes identified as a horrifying flesh blob. So I have spun this research into a series of image generations across multiple stages of different generative AI systems to see how they all interpret the same prompts. So this project's still ongoing, and it may never actually have an end date, as new versions keep coming out of all of these systems. So I keep testing each new one. But the biases are still very clear. And if we move on to the next one, we'll see mid-journey from version 1 to version 6 of non-binary people at the beach. So just in looking at these generated images of non-binary people, I've noticed the same trends. Every person is young. Almost all of them have short, fairy hair, pale skin, and most of them are femme, despite the many non-binary people I know with beards. I've never seen any generated on a any beards generated on a non-binary person using a generative AI without specifically asking. Actually, apart from the age, they tend to look very similar, which is great for all the people who fit that box, I guess. But what about the non-binary people of color? What about all the high femme or high mask non-binary people? It's so very hard to get a non-white, non-binary person that even if I explicitly state an ethnicity, it still struggles. So the Eurocentric biases of these systems are known and researched. They've always been very strong. But for non-binary representation, it's an almost impassable barrier. Taking that research a bit further. Sorry, my cat's decided he's going to be a part of this. So for the next slide, yeah, I decided to look in some similar directions for some of my new work to explore how text to image systems view a pixelated image of a person and then reinterpret it as a new image. So this shows the biases of the system very clearly by making it personal, shows how these systems average out features and remove individuality through their biased data. So this is really a very early preview exploration of a work I've been working on, where I send a pixelated image to the clip captioner, which generates a caption and then sends that caption to Stable Diffusion to generate a new image using the pixelated image as a reference image. So it uses both the caption, the generated caption, and the pixelated image to create a new image. I really liked this result. That probably says something about me that I needed to interrogate a bit further. Sometimes I actually felt quite affirmed by this one. Sometimes AI systems don't entirely suck, except that they do. Let's be honest. Generative AI is a scourge. But I think that the stereotypes and the averaging out of these systems make them rich to interrogate and explore. So next slide for the next work. The final project in my PhD, Gender Tapestry, brought together the insights from my earlier works into a unified piece. This interactive project aimed to reframe gender classification as a spectrum rather than a binary, using a custom classifier that assigned each participant a unique color. This image is from its presentation during Photo 2024 at RMIT Gallery. The dataset for this work was mostly generated. It felt less problematic to use generated images, and originally I had an even spread across all genders. However, I found that the color results in that case were very limited. They tended to average out to very muddy colors, not a wonderful diverse rainbow, which was what I was hoping for. I actually needed to introduce bias, which surprised me so much. So unfortunately, I did bias the data, having spent so much of my machine learning life talking about the evils of bias and complaining about all the problems with bias. I actually had to bias data. So I actually learned that sometimes bias does serve a purpose. And I biased it in line with the current representational data that we have on non-binary and transgender representation. These images were generated in StyleGAN 2, and I labeled them according to pronouns and according to 6 different categories of pronoun sets and across multiple different labels. So if we look at the next slide, we can see some of the results. Users would upload an image of their face, which is analyzed by a multi-label classifier trained on pronoun-based data sets. So instead of assigning a gender, the classifier outputs percentages that correspond to red, green, and blue RGB values. These values were used to generate a custom color, which represented the user's unique experience of gender. The user's color and portrait were then added to a growing data set, which was used to generate a mosaic of GAN-generated faces. Now, over time, the mosaic became increasingly complex as more colors and images were added, illustrating the diversity of gender experience. Because gender isn't just what we see on the surface. Gender isn't just an easy box. Gender is unique. Gender is individual. And I equated it in this case to color perception. We see color differently. I can say that the sky is blue. You will see a different shade of blue to the shade of blue I see. So I equated color perception with gender perception, and how our individual experiences of gender shape who we are and shape our own experience of gender. Everybody has a slightly unique experience of their own gender. If we look at the next slide, there's a photo that it delights me of people looking at finding their photos in the mosaic at Acme during the first live presentation of this piece. And I don't know, I just managed to catch it at a really good time, and I love that image. So the concept of assigning color to gender stem from the idea that like color perception, gender is subjective and deeply personal. So while two people might have similar experiences, none are exactly alike. And this approach challenged the feasibility of gender classification by AI, emphasizing that gender isn't something that can or should be reduced to a binary. And it's not something that can or should be classified just from our faces. So on the next slide, we've got our key takeaways. Across these projects, I explored the ways AI reflects human biases and the potential for creative interventions to challenge those biases. Some of my findings include, some of these we knew. Bias is deeply embedded in data sets. Even when AI systems are trained on neutral data, the assumptions of their creators shape their outputs. AI can evolve, but not perfectly. While new data can shift a model's perspective, it often retains traces of its original biases, much like humans do. Representation matters. Expanding data sets to include more diverse identities is crucial for creating more equitable systems, but it's still only part of the solution. Through my practice, I hope to highlight not only the limitations of AI, but also its potential as a medium for reflection, critique, and growth. AI systems may never fully compute what gender means, but by questioning their outputs and our own biases, we can move towards a more inclusive future. So if we move to the next slide, I believe we've got a video. Initially, humans are taught how to perceive gender. They learn what gender is from their parents, their teachers, and peers. As they grow and learn, they learn to perceive gender how they want to perceive it. They research or they don't. They learn and listen, and their understanding of the concept of gender grows. Similarly, machines are taught how to perceive gender by humans. They are shown images and told that these images correspond to gender. An AI will not update its definitions on gender unless it's instructed to. It will not change its perspective or enhance its understanding unless it is specifically trained or retrained. It can only do as its instructions permit. It then falls to the people training the AI and constructing the datasets to ensure that it's trained without bias. A computer itself has no inherent bias. It's only taught bias as it learns and incorporates biased data and algorithms. The people working with the AI, therefore, need to understand the potential for bias and inherent issues in facial classification tasks, including gender classification. People are naturally, consciously or unconsciously biased, and their inherent biases creep into their work. And sometimes we need to bias in other ways. And that's one of the things that I learned is that it's not a binary. we can help subvert these biases in AI by being self-aware of our own biases and our own issues. Gender is an ever-evolving social construct informed by experience and upbringing. Similarly, AI is an ever-evolving machine construct with human-supplied inputs that could be equated to a form of experience and upbringing. Raising an equitable AI requires the voices of many and the intention to listen when issues are exposed. As we are currently in the nascent stages of understanding AI, now is the best time to explore how they interrelate. Untangling the convergence of machine learning and social change is a key requirement right now, especially as AI development is so rapid. The time is ripe to merge these developments and realize we cannot train AI in the outdated social mores of the past, but rather to think ahead to a new stage of development and understanding of ourselves and our AI. We need to be aware and critical of our biases, examining the data sets we create and the methods we use to train AI. This vigilance isn't just about fairness, it's about creating systems that reflect humanity in its fullness, not just a narrow biased sliver of it. And that brings me to the last slide and why this work matters. It's not just about AI and data sets, it's about us. It's about how we define ourselves and each other, how we interact with technology, and how those interactions shape our future. If we allow AI to learn from our worst habits, our biases and prejudices and assumptions, it will replicate and reinforce them in ways we might not even notice until it's too late. But if we teach AI to recognize the diversity and fluidity of human identity, if we build systems that acknowledge and celebrate the complexity of gender, we're not just making better AI, we're creating a reflection of a better world, one that sees and values everyone. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jay. I will just exit out of this and jump over to these slides.
Thank you so much for sharing the slides. It made it much easier.
No worries. Sorry about the video, everyone.
Oh, do we have time for questions or
Yes.
not?
Yeah. I was just gonna,
cool.
Milena's just gonna quickly share these links in the chat for those who want to drop off now before we jump into questions. So we would love to hear any feedback, and then also feel free to join our Slack community as well. We might not have time for breakout, so I'll jump to questions. Thanks, Lauren.
Oh, sorry, I ran over a little, didn't I?
No, that's right. That's right. No worries. Lauren has a great question here for you, Jay. So it is, what advice do you have for people building with AI at work, either in a B2B or B2C context? That's the first one.
Okay. So in a business to business or business to company?
Customer. Like,
Customer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, it's been a minute.
No
So building AI for a business to business or business to customer relationship, I think it's important to consider what do you want to say? Why do you need to capture certain metrics? So with gender capturing, you actually don't need AI. You can just have a checkbox or just have a field, or a series of checkboxes, or drop down boxes, or self-describe. The main question is what do you need the AI for? What do you need it to say? What do you need it to do? And why? I think would be my main parts. And then I'd be looking at the data, looking at how can we make this as equitable as possible? Who do we need to represent? Why do we need to represent them and show them? And how best can we represent everyone who might come across it, remembering that experience and diversity is vast. I mean, there's a lot of research out there on the racial biases inherent in AI, and I'm not really as much of an expert as many other people on that subject. I'm very white. But the for me, for gender is obviously my area, but disability is another area that has to be considered, and access, inclusion, all the things that go into it's. AI likes to, especially generative AI, likes to kind of aggregate things to the middle, or to the peaks of the data, and often forgets the outliers. And often when we're training AI, we kind of forget the outliers as well. And so I guess as an outlier, I like to try and make sure that companies and people training AI know to consider people. One of the advice I do give is to look at your team, the team training the AI, and look around, talk to the people who are in the team. If they all look like you, then you might need to bring in some other voices, at least bring in some consultation from other people, and other representations to and make sure that you're not missing anybody out. So that's one of my simple little guidelines.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah, Jay, I find this fascinating that you're being a hands-on practitioner, really starting at the training data, the data set underlying, versus probably like me this week, I've been reading a lot about DeepSeek, the new model out of China, and how, well, every LLM actually, especially the consumer versions that people are interacting with, actually has another layer on top that encodes the biases and the overt political stances of the company or the country that produced it. And people are finding interesting ways to work around that by asking it to respond in Morse code or other ways that actually it will then give you the answers you want. I guess, I mean, you're not even looking at that level, but like, what do you see as how does a normal person navigate this? How does someone who isn't a PhD in AI understand that when they type into Chat GPT, they're not getting that they're getting a very biased interpretation? Like, what can we do to sort of make that more clear to people who aren't at 9 a.m. in the morning listening to a talk on gender and AI?
I think that we need more awareness. We need to teach people how to do these things, and we need I mean, of course, my answer is always education, isn't it? Because that's what I do. But one of the things I do. But I also that's why I create art, is to get people thinking about these and talking about these problems, and to show them why it's a problem. I think we need more people being shown that this is a problem. This is why you can't rely on that. There's a big push for using generative AI in schools at the moment. And that's terrifying because there's not enough teaching around why it's a problem. It makes up sources, it makes up quotes. I come down a bit hard on my students for using it, because hi, this is plagiarism. You're not allowed to do this at university. I'm sorry. But it's how do we teach them that it's deeply biased? We have to start at the very beginning. I start with my kid, who is very, very much aware, probably more than their peers, and they then tell their peers. The Whisper Network is probably our friend, talking about it, sharing it on social media, and saying this isn't on, y'all. We gotta do better than this. I wish there was a simple solution, though.
Yeah, and sort of carrying on from that, like something I mentioned, we were talking about in the comments, you probably can't see them right now, is right now, given the political situation in the US and many other countries, I imagine that embedding any sort of gender or racial identification in your applications, you have a real, it's not just it creates a bad image of a non-binary person. This could actually lead to real world harm, right? If you identify someone that then targets them for persecution. So should we actually be just trying to remove this as much as possible to avoid that situation?
100%. We don't need it. Why do we need gender capture in the first place, and things like that? We don't. Most people need it for marketing. My answers is always comes back to capitalism, but it's true. In this one, it's about the marketing, and it's about selling people things, and it's about capitalism and keeping people down who they want to have oppressed. And sorry.
Lauren, you had a question, another one?
Sure, yeah, if I'm allowed to ask a second one. But thank you, Jay. This has been great. So my other question, I really loved the paper you were speaking about. Well, not the findings of it, but the one about looking at balance and just, shocking, but not surprising, not shocking, makes me angry, but not surprising to hear about, it's a kitchen or children, and then gets encoded with the gender as being a woman. And so I'm curious to hear what other AI artists or AI critics do you follow? Who else would you recommend we follow to get more of these great discussions in our lives?
I'm a huge fan of Timnit Gebr and Joy Buolamwini and Margaret Mitchell, the classics, the legends of the field. I love Janelle Shane for anything wacky. I think Holly Herndon's doing some interesting interrogative AI art, and I think that I really also enjoy Anna Redler's work. I think that she's really relating to, while it's not about the same sort of topics I explore, I think that she really looks into the market of AI in a fascinating way, and data sets in a fascinating way. Also, Tom White. Tom White is a fascinating artist. Really beautiful work. I think I follow. Eric Savagier as well. The sudden moment where you go, I have only read that name. I have not heard it pronounced. But yeah, some excellent people there. I think all on Blue Sky.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Oh. Thanks, Jake. Did anyone else have any last questions before we close out? We probably don't have time.
I had a question. More from like a practitioner's perspective. I'm curious to know if you've seen examples of companies actually, or like acknowledging we exist in capitalism, but more impact-driven companies or not-for-profits that have done a great job of being transparent with the development of like their AI products. And an example would be the Model Cards framework by Gebru. Like, have you seen that actually been publicly executed on by a company where you can kind of see the outcomes, or like metrics on how models are biased and what they're doing to not make them biased?
I think that I really like MS Coco. I think we're incredibly forthcoming. Everything was online. Everything is very accessible. I think that, and they responded to me straight away when I asked them questions, which was delightful. I think that when something is corporate led, it's a lot more closed down, and that makes it hard to. So we get the weights shown. So DeepSeek is currently the topic, the flavor of the week. DeepSeek are open source in that they share their weights, and they share some of their information, but they don't share the data sets. And I'm finding that more and more the data sets are impossible to find, and that's distressing. Like, did I enjoy the problems with MS Coco's data set? Absolutely not. But I enjoy that I was able to explore them. I hate to say a generative AI company, but Stable Diffusion suck, but at least they've everything's open source. Their code's online. The data set has been shared, and that allowed us to share. We could find the problems in their data set, and then they had accountability for their problems. So when we found, I didn't, but when a child sexual abuse material was found in the data set, they were held accountable and they took it down. And that is why transparency is so critical, as we all know. So look, I'm going to give them credit. They are also apparently trying to exclude artists who are opting out. It should have been opt-in, but at least they're trying something. Better than nothing.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. We probably have time for one last question if anyone had any. Otherwise, we will round out there. We're going to post the survey and link to our Slack again in the comments, please, Melinda. Thank you. And but otherwise, we'll stop there. And yeah, big thanks to Jay for sharing all your knowledge with us today. Really enjoyed your talk, and I personally learned a lot. Also, thanks to the community for some great, insightful questions, and the chat really blew up. So yeah, appreciate it. In terms of the next TLC, we have yet to announce it, so we'll be sure to announce that soon. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Great to see you, Jay.
Great to see you. I it's so exciting that you were at Acme. I remember that. It was